my channel. In today's video, we are going to be doing some ink smooshing, just playing with our inks, some embossing, and making some what I intended to be 5x7 cards, but I end up having to cut those down. So I have a full sheet of CANSON XL watercolor paper here. This is 9x12, and I cut it on the 12-inch side at 6. And I have the Botanical Hearts stamp set here from Simon Says Stamp. I'm going to use that large floral heart there. And I'm going to place it in the middle of these papers. And what I intended was maybe trying to get like 2 cards out of each of these, so getting a total of 4 cards. But plans kind of had to adapt as we went. So we're going to use Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated inks and rhubarb, apple, and cranberry. And then I also have some Distress Oxides we're going to use as well, just to show that you can use pretty much whatever inks you have on your stash and have in your stash as long as they are water reactive. I have this grip mat here from Altenew. This was a gift with purchase many years ago, and I don't use it very often, but I decided to use it today just so that there's a difference in surface. So I could absolutely use my glass surface there, but the water and the ink beat up on it differently when you add the water. And so I chose to use this mat, and I'm going to stain the fire out of this mat with these reds. I should have known that when I started. So if I wanted to keep it pristine white, I should have not used this because it will be stained by the time we're done. So we're making some Valentine's Day cards here today. These didn't quite turn out like I hoped, but it's okay. I have this fine mister that I purchased off of Amazon. The one I had before from Hobby Lobby died, and so I purchased this 2-pack off of Amazon, which was cheaper than the one that I purchased at Hobby Lobby, so go Amazon. Okay, so I wanted to have a lot of interest, a lot of movement in these panels, and this one ends up just looking red. It just looks really red. I got a little carried away with my water, and it just ended up looking red. You can't even see, all you see is that apple color, really. You don't see any of the cranberry, really, and you definitely don't see any of that rhubarb. So learn from my mistake. Don't add so much water, and maybe add even less of that apple if you were to repeat these same color combinations. And one of the things to note when you are doing this, if you want lots of texture and lots of movement, you have to heat set in between layers. If you don't, so think of it this way. If you dry in between layers, you will layer, okay? But if you don't, all you're going to do is mix. So they'll blend. So if you don't heat set, they're going to blend, and you'll get a not as much like variation. But if you do heat set, then you will start to layer and get more movement. And that's what I really wanted. So I do try to, it's not like bone dry, but it is dry to the touch. And I'm just pouncing it back in this pigment again. I'm really trying to get some more texture in this. This one does not turn out at all like I envisioned, but I do get more of what I had in my head when we switched to our oxides. So I just continued to do that, heat set and pounce it into the pigment until I was happy, or happier. And then I set that one aside. Now we're going to move on to our Distress Oxides. I have KITSCH Flamingo, Picked Raspberry, and I think that's Candied Apple. And I learned from the previous one not to add so much of that red. It just kind of has a tendency to overtake. And as you can see, my mat is now very stained. Reds in particular, or purples that have a lot of red in them, will do that. So I tried to not only use less of the Candied Apple, but to spread it out a little more. And I'm not putting down as much water also. And that CANSON XL watercolor paper has a smoother side and a more textured side. Because I was going to do some heat embossing over this, and that Botanical heart stamp set is pretty detailed, I chose to do my ink smooshing on the smoother side just so that I wouldn't lose all of that detail. And as you can see, we have a lot more color variation in this one, and I think that's because I didn't put so much water down. And I learned to not put so much of, in this case, it would have been the candied apple, but that picked raspberry is pretty strong also. But I did get a lot more variation in color and pattern and texture with this, and I do think that has a lot to do with the amount of water I added. These panels really don't take very long, and like I said, I'm not heat setting them until they're bone dry, but I'm heat setting them to where the pigment isn't moving anymore. And then I will repeat the pouncing process. I did feel like I lost some of that candied apple in the Distress Oxide one, so I did go back and clean off the mat and add just a couple more daubs of the candied apple and pounce it into that. And then that one was done. So this is both of them done. As you can tell, they look pretty, particularly that Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated one. It looks very one note, meaning it looks like there's just one color there, which if that's the look you're going for, awesome. But that was not what I was going for. So I'm trying to get a little more interest to this panel. So I just put some clean water onto an acrylic block, and I'm using just a water brush pen, but you can use a regular paintbrush, whatever you want, to flick some water onto this panel. I wasn't getting the results that I wanted, so I'm going to pull a Christina Werner and just sprinkle water into my hand or put water in my hand and then sprinkle that on there. I do let this sit for a while. You could do this in layers and not let it sit as long one time and then do it again and let it sit a little bit longer, and it'll almost bleach out the pigment, which again gives you just a little bit more interest. So I did let this sit for a little bit before I grabbed a paper towel and cleaned it off and kind of dabbed up the excess. And that's what that one looked like when it was done. I did think about putting on some gold speckles, splattering on some gold, but I decided not to, although you absolutely could. So I originally was going to put this into my regular size Misty, but it's just probably about 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch too long. So I grabbed my Tim Holtz one, and it just, the paper can hang out off to the right-hand side, but the stamp can't. Because there is a little bit of a bevel on the edge there. So centering this in the middle was absolutely fine. I do grab a little piece of tape to kind of adhere that in there. I'm trying something a little bit different with how to clean off my stamps. I have been using the scrubber pad from Hero Arts, but I find that those are kind of expensive. I know I've heard of people washing them, but mine, I don't know if I'm letting them go too long, but mine were starting to separate. Like the scrubber part was starting to separate from the Velcro part. And so washing them, I think, would make that worse. So I'm trying something a little bit different. I purchased these chamois off of Amazon, and they are rather large. So I just cut them down into more manageable size. And I'm going to give those and these microfiber cloths also from Amazon a try. Just to see if I can get cleaner results and my stamps don't have fuzzies on them, which make it to where I don't have as crisp of images. So I'm making sure that these panels are dry completely. I did dry them off screen for a while because I was going to do this heat embossing and I really didn't want the embossing powder to stick absolutely everywhere. So I am testing these panels just to ensure that they are indeed dry. There were a couple corners that had some embossing powder still sticking to them. That wasn't a big deal just because I wasn't going to be embossing in those particular areas, so it really didn't matter. But the center where I was embossing was dry. So I repeated that with the other panel just to ensure it was dry. And then we're going to go ahead and do our heat embossing. I'm using Princess Gold embossing powder from Ranger, and I used my anti-static powder tool and treated the paper first. Then I am stamping in VERSAMARK ink, and I did stamp it twice. My stamp was a little bit dirty. My 3-year-old daughter likes to play with my stamps sometimes, and she has her own ink pads, but she does not know to clean them off. And so it was a little dirty. But that's not a big deal because I was putting gold embossing powder over it. That would be a bigger deal if I was maybe using white or a clear. That would probably be a bigger deal. But for the gold, it wasn't. But if you are going to be using one of those embossing powders, please ensure that your stamp is clean before you go and stamp on your project. I had a couple spots that were giving me some fits, so I had to do a little CPR method on them to get them to stick, or to get the ink to transfer. And here I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle on that Princess Gold embossing powder. And I'm going to repeat this for the second panel, put on my anti-static powder tool, stamp it 2 or 3 times just to ensure I've got a good image with that VERSAMARK ink, and then again sprinkle on this Princess Gold embossing powder, and then I will heat set those. You know that metallics in particular are heat set when they are no longer grainy and dull, but are smooth and shiny. So you've seen me in the past heat set from the back. I felt like I got better results that way, but today I was living on the edge and I heat set from the front and it turned out fine. I don't know why. Sometimes I feel like I get better results when I heat set from the back, and other times it doesn't matter. But on this situation, it didn't really seem to make a big difference. I originally set out to do a 5x7 card, but that did not work. So I did trim these down, the paper, or the ink smushed panels down to 4 by 5 1/4. And then I have a gold mat, that is Paper Studio cardstock, so that's from Hobby Lobby. That measures 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. That's just going to give me a little bit of a mat here on each of these cards. And then I have some cardstock that are some card bases that I made from cardstock that I get from Cardstock Warehouse, and I will put those colors down below. I think this one is Cherry from Lessebo, and the other one is Bubblegum. I think that one's also from Lessebo. It might be Color Plan. I'm not sure. I'll be sure to list it down below. Like I said, I originally set out to make a 5x7 card. That layout just didn't really work. So I did trim these card bases down to be 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. On the ink smush panels, I did put some strips of foam tape from Amazon and then layered that on top of the gold panel. And then I'm going to adhere the gold panel down flat to our card base, and I'm going to repeat that on both of the cards. That just gives them a little bit more interest, gives them a nice, like, complete and finished look. It reminds me a lot of Gina K, only Gina has a tendency to use like a black layer, like a black mat, but the layering concept is very Gina K. And I just really liked that gold mat there. I thought that was really pretty. And I did repeat that on both cards. One of our sentiments is going to come from this Spring Bouquets stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. I'm going to use the Sending You Love. One of them is going to come from that, and I'm just stamping that on scraps of that cardstock. And then the other one is going to come from that same Botanical Hearts stamp set. And I'm going to heat emboss both of those on just scraps of that same cardstock that we used for the card bases. We're going to do the same process, treat with our anti-static powder tool, stamp in VERSAMARK ink, and sprinkle on that same Ranger Princess Gold embossing powder. I'm going to use a banner die for one of these sentiments, but if you don't have a banner die, here's a quick and dirty way to make a banner. So you cut it down to about the length that you want it to be. You put a slit in the middle, and then you connect each of those points. So you go from the end of the cardstock and connect it to the point that you made, and then it'll give you like a fishtail banner in. So here we're going to snip it in the middle. Then we're going to go from one corner and meet that snip in the middle. And then we're going to go from the other corner and meet that snip in the middle. And that's just a quick and dirty way if you don't have a sentiment banner set, or you don't want to do partial die cutting, or, you know, what have you. That's just a kind of a quick way to make one. And it turns out okay. That sentiment banner came from Simon Says Stamp stitched sentiment label banner dies. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, okay, that pink bubblegum doesn't really go. It looks kind of funny. The color just isn't quite right. And I know that we matted it on that bubblegum cardstock, but it just didn't look quite right. So I grabbed some abandoned coral distress oxide ink, and I'm going to end up just ink blending that all over the top of it. I did test it on the back just to make sure that it wouldn't look weird. No one's going to see the back, and I liked how that looked a lot better. It just seemed to kind of match better. So I'm just going to be brave and ink blend that over the entire banner, and then I'm going to use a dry cloth to kind of buff off the embossing, or excuse me, the ink that is sitting on top of that embossing powder. I'll use more of that Amazon foam tape to apply foam tape to the back of these banners, these sentiments, and then I'm going to stick those in place, and then these cards will be done. Here's a closer look at both of those cards. You could have added gems or sequins or, what have you, more splatters, but I liked how these looked in the end, and I'm glad that I kind of stuck with it. So I appreciate you spending time with me. I hope you felt inspired, and we will see you next time. Bye.